Good afternoon. Just see the numbers bouncing up very quickly as we start this webinar. I know that there are over 100 people booked to attend, so we'll just give them a couple of minutes as we all familiarise ourselves once again with the vagaries of Zoom, and we'll get the webinar started. Just to say, for those who have already joined, if you can use the Q&A function to record any queries you've got as the webinar runs through, that would be really appreciated. We'll pick up those questions at the end, as many as we can. If we do run out of time for any reason, then Mark has very kindly said that he will pick up those queries and respond to them as part of a follow-up to the webinar and when we publish that online. So the webinar is being recorded, and you will be sent a recording or a link to the recording in due course as well. And so just if we start, welcome to the latest PFH webinar. Today we're very kindly been joined by Mark Astbury from Ridge. Mark, if you're not familiar with Mark, he's been supporting the sector and is a partner at Ridge for the last 30 years. Leads one of the housing teams looking after the public sector housing providers. His team deliver around 30,000 stock condition surveys on an annual basis, and he has been kind enough to do similar webinars in the past for us, and is an expert in his field in terms of supporting the social housing sector. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark, and we'll hear about the Decent Home Standard Review.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking some time out to hopefully hear some interesting points in terms of the Decent Home Standard Review. As Paul said, I've not quite been at Ridge 30 years. I have been in the construction sector for some time, longer than I care to remember. I've been at Ridge for about 20 years, so that's the amount of time that I've been specifically working in the affordable housing sector. I'm a chartered building surveyor by background. Please don't hold that against me. Fellow of the RICS, and also did a sort of further qualification with the Chartered Institute of Housing, more to understand the more sort of day-to-day operational challenges that we face in housing, rather than just being someone who's all about bricks and sticks and building surveying type stuff. So that's enough about me. In terms of the areas that I would like to cover today, I will do a very brief introduction to Ridge, because I know you're not here to listen to a sales pitch about Ridge, but just to give you sort of a bit of a background to us, how our team sits in with other services that Ridge provide, and then really move into the bulk of the sort of presentation around the context and background for the Decent Home Standard Review, and sort of our views and what we're expecting to see from the revised standard. And I would state that these are sort of our views and what we've discussed with some of our clients and other sort of stakeholders within the sector. Obviously it's in a certain stage at the moment, so the information we have as consultants isn't necessarily directly from DLUC, but anyway, we'll outline what we think's coming, etc. I generally tend not to, you probably be pleased to hear, I don't generally tend to read slides. So if there are any questions around slides, contents, hopefully there's no sort of abbreviations or acronyms that you won't be familiar with. But certainly, Paul, if there are any specific questions about something that's on the slide, then please do interrupt me and I will clarify it if needs be. So, but hopefully that won't be a problem. So very briefly, in terms of Ridge and Partners, we've been around since about 1946, so established as a quantity surveying sort of cost consultancy practice, grown considerably, particularly over the last few years. We're about 1,200 people now, so even an update on the figure that's on that slide. So we are sort of multidisciplinary property and construction consultants, so engineers, surveyors, architects, planners, etc. About the only thing we don't do is valuation work. We do pretty much everything else through the entire life cycle of a property. We have various areas of expertise, and towards the bottom there, property consultancy is the discipline which I am responsible for, and we have team members down here in Winchester, where I'm based, but also in Manchester, where Matthew Stringer heads the team up there, and an evolving and growing team in the London office. So there's about 20 of us, and we are all about affordable housing, as I'll come on to say. That's very brief in terms of where we are in terms of locations. So a reasonable spread certainly in England, and yeah, looking to expand as we continue to grow as a practice into other areas in the UK. In terms of property consultancy, team's been around for about 25 years, coinciding with the initial drive by the government to improve the quality of local council housing, etc. So that starting of the sort of decent homes process in 2010, and sorry, in 2000, and then later obviously with the stock option appraisal process. So we in those days were the managers of stock condition surveys on behalf of others to inform that stock option appraisal process, whether large-scale voluntary transfers happened, formation of ALMOs, etc., or indeed retention of stock. So we were feeding into those sort of option appraisals with the stock survey data, commonly a single sheet of A4 with a 30-year projection in terms of the stock's reinvestment requirements, but also looking at obviously the calculation of decent homes and improving and meeting that standard by the 2010 deadline, as it was in those days. So very much a sort of specialist in large-scale stock condition surveys, but also then the related asset management type consultancy services that come off the back of that. So as are listed on that slide. So that's a little background to our team. So we very much come from it as our day job and what we do, and how we help clients with the challenges around stock surveys, etc. Obviously, in terms of the context of sort of affordable housing, and particularly the roles of asset managers, etc., there is obviously an awful lot going on within the sector, and I've just listed there some of the sort of the spinning plates that many of us have got in terms of trying to meet the requirements of those bullet points within the resources and time that we have available to meet those challenges. And I think the focus on the decent homes update and bringing it back, up to date is very much got to be mindful of also those other aspects that are listed there on that slide. Continuing, obviously, fuel poverty, tying that in with the thermal comfort requirements, etc. Obviously, there's been some fairly recent guidance and update on condensation, damp and mould from the government, which was published earlier this month. Talk about that in a moment. And also last week, some changes to probably some of the milestones around net zero carbon, which was maybe not unexpected, but probably not welcome, particularly within the sector. But certainly the feedback I've seen is we're going to strive to continue, irrespective of the sort of 2025 milestones probably being relaxed. So that's the sort of context. There's an awful lot going on, an awful lot of challenges in terms of the affordable housing sector, and then we're sort of moving into specifics around the decent home standard. So set out there is just literally a bit of a background in terms of going back to those sort of early 2000s in terms of when decent homes came in, and the guidance that was then the Office for the Deputy Prime Minister, ODPM, before becoming the Department for Communities, Levelling and Government, Government, Communities and Local Government, DCLG. The key thing for there, obviously, in terms of decent homes, is that the definition guidance hasn't been updated since June 2006. So obviously quite long in the tooth. There was the select committee work done in 2010 in terms of beyond decent homes and how affordable housing providers would continue to meet the obligations of decent homes, which has never sort of gone away. It's still part of the home standard and still a compliance and regulatory requirement. But probably fair to say it probably wasn't in as much focus as it was sort of 15 years ago. Then since then and more recently, there's obviously been the comments and statements made within various social housing white paper, as it was in November 2010, in terms of reviewing the decent homes standard and updating it. Then the consultation process, which commenced in early 2021, and then further commitments that I'll come on to in terms of the levelling up white paper in February 22, as well as the private rented sector white paper and the inclusion of private rented sector within or being covered by the decent home standard. So in short, probably a well overdue update and a number of commitments that have been made by Michael Gove and the government in terms of getting the standard revised and updated. In terms of decent homes, obviously it's key, and as I'm sure you'll remember, it was always supposed to be a minimum standard. And certainly, if we look at it now, we would say yes, it definitely was a low standard, but there was also various ways it could be interpreted, which I'll come on to in terms of just looking at the criterion again. But it was, at the time, it did trigger significant investment in affordable housing, with the aim of having that baseline of a minimum standard across all of sort of social stroke affordable housing. But as you say, the commitment to do that review was made by the government, and there was a sounding board set up in terms of residents, experts, landlords, to sort of review the decent home standard, and that sort of formed part of the sort of first stage of this sort of consultation. And as mentioned, it was then extended to private rented sector, but I'll do a little bit more in terms of the timeline, in terms of how that's proceeded. So, as I say, those sounding boards were set up and looked at those potential, issues, concerns, vagaries, etc., within the original standard. And then so part one was early 2021. The part two elements, which commenced in March 2022, then paused, and basically that was the then inclusion of the private rented sector, as I've mentioned, and then part two sort of restarted once the PRS element had been included within the sounding board in terms of representation. So originally, that part two consultation, I think, was due to get concluded by June this year. That was then subsequently extended, and there's still the intention that there will be a wider consultation potentially later this year. But obviously those dates might well move now that we are almost into October. The intention was that the Decent Home Standard publication would happen in March 2024 originally, but I haven't seen any sort of further statements as to when that date might be. I'm suspecting it will probably move out, given where we are in the consultation stages at the moment. So that's kind of the review process to date. Just mentioned those stated aims in terms of what was in the levelling up white paper at the time, which as you can read there was obviously, to reduce the number of non-decent homes and make sure that was consistent across all sort of tenant types. So there's a lot of background and commitment to it, but probably just worth sort of doing a bit of a reminder in terms of the decent home standard. So what I'm intending to do now is literally just a very brief reminder in terms of what the various criterion set out. And then, as I said, our views and those of those people we've spoken to and clients, etc., in terms of where we think the decent home standard could move to, and potentially what those sorts of impacts are going to be, for asset managers that obviously need to be able to maintain data and be able to measure themselves against potentially a new standard, and what impacts that could have. So that was the overall sort of statement in terms of the decent home standard. So as I said, it's a minimum standard, which to all intents and purposes should have been met by 2010, but then maintained thereafter. There were a number of later round HOLMOs that got an exception to that 2010 deadline, plus others that didn't quite make it, etc. So, but important to remember that it was an ongoing commitment and is still part of that home standard and compliance requirements. So it's never gone away. It's probably not had the focus that it had several years ago. But as I say, it was also that sort of catalyst for better asset management, which I think as a sector has greatly improved since then, with more effective asset management principles, but also asset performance and understanding whether investment should be made into property, not just spending money on it and banging in kitchens and bathrooms and windows and doors, etc., without sort of thinking properly about an asset's performance and whether it makes sense to undertake that investment. So as I say, it should be part of a sort of reinvestment strategy, but also taking into consideration a number of other factors, and the underlying sort of requirement in terms of decent homes and any other investment is obviously up-to-date, robust and accurate stock condition survey data. And I'm not just saying that because obviously we do that sort of work, but that really is that foundation part. So that was the sort of the decent home sort of setting out sort of reminders in terms of objectives. 4 criteria, which you can read there. So hopefully familiar in terms of those 4 components, and failure with any one of those would constitute a failure in terms of the decent home standard as it stands at the moment. So we'll have a look at each of those 4 criteria in terms of what they set out in the original guidance, and then where we think they are going to be moving to in terms of the update, which is basically what that slide said. Sorry. So anything on there I haven't covered? One point, yes, just in terms of the changes, it is likely that the changes to the decent home standard will come in ahead of any legislation changes to enact that. So particularly around HHSRS, which I'll come to in a second, likely the changes to the decent home standard will happen ahead of the sort of legislation changes that it may need to incur for certain elements of the standard. So there will be a sort of timing issue, and we'll need to see how that's implemented and how the standard goes live. So we'll have to see what the timetable is like for that. So in terms of what we can expect in terms of criterion A, so the current statutory minimum standard for housing. So this is around the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, HHSRS. Generally within the sector, we are using the indicative 19-point process in terms of assessing HHSRS. It's not the full version 2 that environmental health type officers, etc., would use, sort of an abridged but recognised process in terms of assessing hazards. Quite a technical and fairly complex process, HHSRS, and struggling with any sort of sleep issues. There is the full version 2 methodology is quite a sizable sort of document, full of lots of statistics and probability, etc., and work done by the universities. But we use that sort of abridged version to look at those 29 potential hazards. That replaced what was Section 60 or Section 604 in 2006. So when the original Decent Home Standard came out, that was referred to Section 604, and so that was replaced by HHSRS in 2006. HHSRS, is important to point out, is an assessment made by the surveyor over a 12-month period. And the reason for pointing that out is it's quite different to obligations under the Homes Act, which I'll come on to in a moment. But it is a sort of 12-month assessment rather than a point-in-time type assessment, which I'll come on to in a moment. So that's and any failure in terms of severe Category 1 hazards, any of those would trigger a failure under this criterion, and so therefore not meet the standard. So that's where we are currently. In terms of potential changes, what there has been is quite a lot of discussion around the HHSRS in terms of it being reviewed. So that was actually reviewed in 2022 with the intention of sort of providing an update and empowering landlords and tenants to engage with it and align it with other legislation and assessments. So saying about the Homes Act, or the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018, that basically has a requirement to mean that homes are safe and healthy and free from things that could cause serious harm. It is, as I mentioned earlier, a point-in-time assessment, assessment or an issue, so something that is already causing harm, and it is assessed by the courts, whereas an HHSRS assessment undertaken by a surveyor, we could be undertaking a assessment now today in September, mild weather, etc. But we have to think about things that maybe in the winter, with cold, ice, snow, etc. Are there going to be risks, that may occur through other seasons or other points than times of the year, not as much light in the winter, etc. So we do have to put our thinking caps on, and through experience understand where hazards may not necessarily be readily identifiable at the time of survey in the middle of summer, but again, may then manifest itself in the winter. Another example of that would be things like condensation, damp and mold. Quite often in the hotter part summers that we've been having recently, the evidence of that may be less because it's been cleaned since it was last an issue, and it's been dry and hot, so it hasn't come back. But as soon as the temperatures start dropping, central heating goes on, damp and mold can start showing itself more prominently. In terms of obviously with AWAB's law, so we're following the unfortunate death of Awab Ishak, living in a house up in Rochdale with significant damp and mold, which affected him and his respiratory issues. There was obviously the undertaking by Michael Gove in February of this year in terms of amendments to what was then the Social Housing Regulation Bill, now Act, to introduce Awab's law, requiring landlords to fix reported health hazards within specified timescales, etc. And again, there's been more recent guidance on that was published on the 7th of September in terms of that link there around understanding and addressing the health risks of damp and mold in the home. So obviously quite a significant, and you should familiarise yourself with that sort of guidance. But again, in terms of the sort of further changes that are anticipated as well as that guidance, I think one of the big issues around its technicality is that residents don't particularly understand it, as indeed other stakeholders don't. So potentially reducing its complexity so it's more understandable, with some simplification, so providing sort of baselines and examples of what a severe or a moderate hazard would look like, maybe removing an element of that sort of subjectivity from the assessments, but also looking at alignment with other safety legislation, particularly fire safety legislation, where we have Fire Safety Act, Building Safety Act as far as higher risk buildings are concerned, and other legislation affecting the home. So things like the gas safety regulations, the electrical safety standards, and the requirements around smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. So again, we may see changes there. I think we are expecting that the current 29 items in terms of how we assess it at the moment will probably be reduced, possibly nearer to sort of 2021, 20 or 21. So we are expecting that to be reduced and simplified, but more guidance and explanation over HHSRS to make it less sort of technical than it is at the moment. It is worth noting that obviously the gas and smoke carbon monoxide regulations that are applicable to PRS, that's probably been adopted by social housing providers already under other legal duties, but most best practice are obviously incorporating the requirements of those regulations anyway. So I think the HHSRS element and the recommendations for the review of it earlier in 2022 was basically to make it simpler, easier for tenants to engage with the system, and make it easier to understand and enforce. And obviously enforcement will tie in with things like tenant satisfaction measures and feedback from residents in terms of performance of the landlord, etc. So so I think they're the main sort of changes around that. As I said, the HHSRS changes will require changes in legislation. So it may be that those happen after the standard guidance has been updated. So criterion A, moving on to the state of repair, the reasonable state of repair. So the table on the right there, which apologies is a little bit difficult to read, basically is setting out the key components and non-key components within table 1 of the standard. So state of repair is really around basically which components within a property can be permissible failures under the current decent home standard. It is quite prescriptive. It probably does set the bar quite low, split between key and non-key components, and currently they are assessed on both age and condition. So as the slide states there, to fail, either key components or non-key components have to fail. They have to be both old and in poor condition, so they can't just fail on one element. And in terms of key components, a property is non-decent if one or more are old and in poor condition, or 2 or more non-key components. So this is where we, this is an area that has always been quite contentious, because just because something's old doesn't mean it's not necessarily performing and perfectly good for use. So it's always been a bit of an anomaly, but also there's that little sort of matrix of permissible failures, which, sitting in your home, would you really allow that number of potential failures and still class something as being decent? So no surprise in terms of the potential changes, which could potentially have quite an impact, certainly in terms of how things are modelled, in terms of potential changes. So we're looking at a focus potentially on condition and a removal of the age element. So that could well end up, we won't need to assess, we still assess condition, but age is not going to be something that potentially needs to be considered as part of that. Again, still survey assessed in terms of a surveyor on site estimating the condition and the remaining life of a component, and still be assessed in that manner. But again, I think the intention is also that things like component life cycles are used more as a guide, rather than being an actual element of the calculation. And obviously the list of components relatively limited, so there could be addition of certainly some of the newer sorts of renewable type elements, sort of heating technologies, things like air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, etc. Elements related to fire safety, in terms of internal doors, cavity barriers, sprinkler systems, cladding, etc. As I mentioned, the damp and mold and the guidance there, but certainly looking at components that can assist with the reduction of that, whether that's sort of ventilation, installations, damp-proof courses, looking at rainwater goods, etc., to protect sort of key components and water ingress. other aspects in terms of the health of residents, and things like lifts, balustrades, handrails, stair treads, etc. But also probably looking a bit further than just the dwelling itself. So areas around public realm, boundary walls, paths, steps, signage, lighting, etc. Certainly things that I've experienced in feedback sessions with residents, looking at planned works programs and asset management strategies, very much safety related, good lighting, those sorts of things in communal areas and on estates, which previously weren't catered for at all within the standard. And then looking at the broader sort of door entry systems, fencing, boundary walls, etc. Communal lifts, etc. All possible areas in terms of further components that could be added to criterion B. So the impact of all that's probably the removal of the age element from the definition, and that's potentially going to give some components a longer life cycle. In terms of if they're assessed still to have a long remaining life, that might well obviously be much longer than their planned sort of life cycle. Just they are old, but they are still functioning. So that could be beneficial. But obviously the other element then will be that there will be a significantly larger list of elements to potentially consider. Modern facilities. So in terms of modern facilities, houses or dwellings or homes non-decent if it lacked 3 or more of those, all but the end bullet point there. So the kitchens of 20 years, the bathrooms of 30 years, etc. So modern facilities did tend to be one of the areas where choices were made between certain components. So bathrooms may have been prioritized because they were less expensive than new kitchens. So a kitchen might fail under modern facilities, but I say, if it lacked 3 or more, then it would fail. But you could have sort of permissible failures. And obviously modern facilities back in 2000, and as then updated in the 2006 guidance, the time now since then, obviously nearly sort of 20 odd years, technology and modern facilities has obviously moved on significantly. So in terms of just to pick up there also, there were those subjective elements around what is something that's got adequate space and layout, and adequate size and layout of common areas, and also if improvements couldn't be made in a property or a block for planning reasons, then that sort of fell outside of the failure in terms of modern facilities. So that was where modern facilities is currently in terms of potential changes that could happen. There's always been the overlap between criterion B and state of repair and the key components, or indeed non-key components, so that you had duplication of things like kitchens and bathrooms. So I think the consultation process to date has suggested that they would be removed from modern facilities and only be a part of criterion B. No surprise in terms of some of those subjective adequacy elements in the current standard, probably providing more guidance on what that means. And also, rather than having if it lacks 3 of those items that I listed previously, if it fails 1, potentially they could say, right, that's a decency failure. In terms of the sort of ventilation requirements, these are already in place in Wales and Scotland, and I should have started out by saying, in terms of decent homes standard at the moment, this is the English version of, so apologies for any of those who may be on the call from other areas, but certainly ventilation requirements are already incumbent within the Welsh and Scottish standards, but also looking at potentially humidity controlled intermittent extractor fans and mechanical extra ventilation elements being included. Potentially also looking around inclusion within modern facilities of things like security elements in new dwellings, so things like doors and window sets, and noting their potential overlap with some of the HHSRS hazards around entry by intruders. Also looking at other sort of more modern sort of safety features, so things like thermostatic mixer valves in hot water supplies, window restrictors, the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors as required by the 2022 regs. Also accessibility and alignment with the Equality Act in terms of ability for modern facilities to have access by all different types of residents, etc. And also prove document H in terms of waste management. Again, another one that potentially could be included within modern facilities. And another one which you may have heard of in terms of floor coverings as well, which obviously in terms of us as sort of stock condition surveyors, it would be sort of something we typically assess under HHSRS in terms of any trips and falls and hazards, but may be another element that would need adding to modern facilities. Moving on to thermal comfort, the last of the criterion. Under this, the existing requirements are for that dwellings to have efficient heating, and so that's defined as gas or oil programmable central heating, or electric storage heaters and other warm air systems, or similar sort of efficient heating systems. And programmable, meaning that both the timing and the temperature can be set by the occupants, but these requirements aren't required in sheltered or elderly persons accommodation for these purposes. And then the second part there, in terms of effective insulation, you're probably aware in terms of gas oil programmable heating, at least 50 mil of lost insulation, which by today's standard is very thin, very little. All those dwellings with electric storage heaters, LPG, solid fuel, etc., 200 mil. So again, more, but still less than probably where we are in terms of current building regulations and expectations in terms of levels for insulation. So that's sort of where we are at the moment in terms of the current standards. So if any of those items fall below those requirements, then that's a failure. In terms of what's coming, obviously we had a slight change in certain elements of thermal comfort last week. Was it last week or the week before? So yeah, potentially the alignment with the clean growth strategy and the expectations to raise the bandings from E to C, which until recently was anticipated to be by 2025, but certainly still expecting to see that the EPC rating and an achievement of at least band C will be part of the update and the amendments. But obviously, in terms of the timescales for achieving that, that's obviously been sort of recently changed, still with a 2050 long-term date, but you will have to see what comes in terms of the standard, in terms of if there's a prescription to reach band C. But at the moment, obviously, we were anticipating that would be 2025, but that's recently changed. We still do have the obviously future home standard, and then by which, from 2025, compliance will be mandatory for new homes built. Obviously, still aiming to produce a sort of 75 to 80% reduction in carbon emissions compared to homes built under the current building regs. So still expecting that to be in place and incorporated within the standard, and obviously alignment to conservation of fuel and power approved document L from the building regs, and also potential for part F in terms of building ventilation, including air quality and prevention of condensation, damp and mold, to also potentially be included within criterion D. So I think the consultation process, I haven't seen any outputs as far as criterion D is concerned, but I think that will be coming. So that is probably, of the four, that's probably the one that has the most sort of alignment to what we're seeing and hearing rather than what's come out of DLUC or from the government more broadly. So pause for breath. That's quite a quick run through where we are now currently with the standard and potentially where those changes are going to be coming from. I think as a summary, obviously some expected changes, some removal of some of the quirks and subjectivity potentially around the standard, but obviously a well overdue update. Things have moved on significantly since 2006. And in terms of the sort of discussion points I've been having or we've been having as a team with clients, just some examples there of things we've been talking about. Obviously tenant satisfaction measures, engagement with residents, particularly around the Building Safety Act and resident engagement strategies, etc. But yes, we'll need to have an eye on anticipating and collecting data as part of stock surveys and including that within reinvestment forecasts, because we've always been advocates that if you look after, maintain good quality stock survey and plan programs around that accordingly, then really decent homes should take care of itself. But obviously we'll wait to see how the standard evolves and develops and specifics that may need to be thought about in terms of how we continue to collect that data. But I've always said stock surveys and housing is relatively straightforward in terms of technology and what we're dealing with. It's just we have a massive volume of them, so that's where it presents its real challenges. So obviously, as a side to all that, if they're including more components and more elements, that the question over funding, we had the benefits of the stock option appraisal process and the significant funding that was injected into the sector in the early 2000s up to 2010. So yeah, the question will be around the resources we've got and how we meet this standard, along with all those other items and background and context issues that I put on one of the earlier slides. So I'll probably stop there, Paul, noting that's probably about 45 minutes. Yeah, happy to potentially open up for if there's any, not just questions, but also observations, because obviously I have given this from the perspective of us and what we do in the sort of consultancy world. So we haven't been part of the sounding boards and the consultation process that has happened to date. So I'm quite happy to hear from others and observations or anything that we haven't said that potentially we think may be coming as part of the update. It's this is just our suggestions and our sort of feeling on how things are going to develop.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I think it's been really informative. A couple of just points from myself, and as somebody who actually trained as an environmental health officer many years ago, it's an interesting and actually remember the introduction of HHSRS and the complexities of it. I think there's a sense of a return to the fitness for human habitation, which is actually a much simpler standard, and actually one that everybody could understand, I think, and that with the complexity of the new system when it came in caused an awful lot of head scratching, I think, as people got their heads round what it was trying to achieve, but it did appear to go around some of the fundamentals that a fitness standard that had been in place for many years had all been familiar with and understood very clearly. Just one question from me around I think some of the methodologies that we're going to be using in the future, and obviously the achievement of net zero carbon targets. There's been quite a lot of discussion around EPC review, and actually updating that standard, because it doesn't really work with some of the technologies that we've now got and anticipate obviously coming to the fore in the future.
Yeah.
How and I'm a little bit out of touch with that, so I don't know if the implications of that EPC standard and how that might change and what impact that might have on obviously the plans and the objectives that housing landlords want to achieve or need to achieve.
Yeah, I think well, we have domestic energy assessors as part of our team, and very used to. I mean, obviously the whole energy assessment and ability to get information and data to inform both investment plans, but also the modelling around how to achieve net zero carbon and what have you. That hasn't been easy of late. You know, certainly there were changes made and access to information from accredited systems, which didn't help, which we now can't do in the same way we used to. But I think we're sort of, you know, we're still doing the sort of EPCs and lodging them into client accounts and providing RDSAP information. And we, you know, we try and future-proof ourselves as much as possible. But you know, until those changes are made, we can only do sort of, you know, the best practice, and you know, as asset managers, what we can anticipate. So we're continuing to, you know, collect that sort of data and information and use that to inform, you know, net zero carbon type strategies, but also the broader reinvestment requirements for stock.
Yeah, yeah. There's no other questions, or how many? As one's literally just popped up, and it says, in addition to the potential changes, what I've also seen is ASB when customers are asked what matters to them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of those softer, not softer, but sort of, I'd call them sort of the softer demand type issues, are certainly things that we consider as part of any sort of option appraisal. So we're talking about the performance of stock, looking at what its cost liabilities are over a 30-year period versus its income. And I think in the early days of Decent Homes, I think, you know, there was a tendency to just be banging in kitchens, bathrooms, and etc. The funding was there, and the contractors were geared up, so there was an awful lot of investment that went on. But I think some of that investment maybe happened in stock that maybe could have done with a bit of a step back and say, does it really make sense to be sticking new kitchens and bathrooms and windows and doors in properties that maybe have all the thermal insulation properties of a paper bag? So needed considerable investment to, you know, to get them even to sort of like a band C. So I think that sort of assessment of things like indices for deprivation, antisocial behaviour, crime, and other sort of what I'd call like neighbourhood community type elements, certainly we do, and we look at that, and we engage with stakeholders and residents, etc., to understand them. To you know, because you know, but bottom line is you could have properties that maybe financially aren't performing, you know, great. They may be sort of an amber or something, but if they're providing a better social purpose and value, etc., then you know that sort of thing needs to be taken into account. And similarly, you may have properties that, you know, on the face of it financially look like they're performing really well, but you know they've got high instances of crime or antisocial behaviour. So whether that finds its way into the standard, because obviously it's difficult to measure and sort of quantify. We tend to do it from feedback from residents and involvement in sort of those sort of asset management type exercises and stock appraisal. Whether there would be an inclusion with, say, you know, the focus of the Decent Home Standard originally was obviously to address, you know, the imbalance and to invest more in more deprived areas, but that tended to be, you know, using things like the indices for deprivation. So whether a measure would be, you know, could be used like that similarly for ASB, haven't seen any sort of mention of that, but you know, it is a relevant point because, you know, decent homes and decent communities, you know, that is part and parcel of that.
And certainly something which I think became to the fore as a result of COVID and lockdowns and people spending more time in those spaces, which you know, changed the focus of how people use those spaces and the environments in which they live.
Yeah, I think that's also tied in with the future home standard as well in terms of expectations, and COVID really did, as you said, highlighted that if you are bound in a place, it's very difficult to, you know, work from home where you literally have no space to do that, and it's, you know, it's really challenging, or there is no available sort of open space from a sort of well-being perspective. So yeah, there's certainly lessons from COVID as well as updating the standard just generally, that need to be thought about.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a few more questions. I'll take them in the order in which they landed in on the screen. So what are the barriers you're facing with stock condition surveys?
The biggest barrier probably at the moment is the availability of surveyors. The stock condition survey market is very, very hot at the moment. It's probably busier than even during the peak of stock option appraisal processes. Unfortunately, I go back 20 years. There is phenomenal demand, and that was triggered by obviously the unfortunate the Grenfell tragedy, and the focus back on existing assets and compliance particularly, but also post-COVID. I think a lot of people had, or it was that sort of thinking time, during the COVID period, and the demand shot up post-COVID in terms of stock surveys. So that is by far and away our biggest challenge. My team could probably be 3-4 times bigger than it currently is if there was that availability of skilled stock survey and domestic energy assessors within the sector. But again, that is a construction and property wide issue around resources, whether it's surveyors or bricklayers or supply of materials, etc. Resources is a considerable challenge.
Yeah, no, very true. Another one, just to follow that up, in terms of, I know an attendee asked the question that in terms of the long-term planning of major works projects, the fabric of buildings, they will remain reasonably simple to forecast and plan for. But the removal of any age criteria for internals will create difficulties in planning for those works. Rather than undertaking full estate replacements on economies of scale, planned internal works may well become more piecemeal. Yeah, won't they? So, I think that's a very real consideration, and that's obviously one of the benefits of the old age-based approach, because you could quite simply say, well, we're just going to go and do all of those.
Yeah, I think it's going to come, as it always has done in terms of assessing from the data. If you have, discounting the fact that things are old, if there is a spread of components that have are reaching the end of their life, so their REM life is assessing it to be fairly short scale. There's going to be more of them, and this is quite important as far as contractors are concerned. Because back in the day, very good at sticking in kitchens and bathrooms and doors and windows. What the supply chain is going to need to be able to react to is a wider spread of potential components that may need replacing. But obviously, we still need to think about it practically in terms of do we start doing internal works packages, and forecasting when it's sensible to do that type of work without it being really piecemeal and interrupting residents' quiet enjoyment, etc. So I think there's going to be more plates to spin in terms of planning, but it will be assessed on condition and when it's going to need replacing, and not necessarily when it's old. So it's going to be a slightly different challenge, but we still need to align that to sensible procurement packages and timing and volumes of work, etc. So it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, no, definitely. In terms of the next question, traditionally the condition surveys have been completed over a 5-year period. It's been suggested that this is not often enough. Do you think that they will include what is a reasonable timeline to do condition surveys, and for them to be reviewed in the new standard?
Potentially, it would be the guidance surrounding collecting, maintaining, and managing stock survey data, because again, that's one of those guides that hasn't been updated for some considerable time. And yes, there was, I think, the Housing Ombudsman's statement a couple of months ago around actually every 5 years probably isn't enough. But different components within a property will naturally, change condition. They vary. Certain elements, are up there for 60 years. They never really seem to change. With other stuff that's more high frequency use, obviously depending on how a resident maintains and utilizes certain elements within property. We are still sort of advocating and including within asset management strategies that data certainly should be no more than 5 years old. And a lot of it has been driven by the resources available to do large scale stock surveys. because if you do 25% a year, do it over a 4-year period, if you've got a reasonable size stock, that can be a significant outlay in terms of resources. Whether you're doing that internally or whether you're using external consultants from the PFH framework, when you start getting into several thousand stock surveys per year, that is a significant sort of investment that needs to occur. But yeah, certainly we're listening to what's happening, and the suggestions are that 5 years is the absolute maximum, maybe needs to be more, but there wasn't sort of any sort of further guidance as to that no one's pulled out a magic number and said it must be every 3 years. So I think it's very much dependent on the location of the stock, the age of the stock. Some HAs have got relatively new stock, so they probably don't need to do that more often than someone's got a lot of Victorian and street properties and stuff that is older. So obviously, since the work was done as part of that decent home standard back to 2010, we're getting to the point now where some of those elements that were done as part of the decent homes works actually are going to be coming due for renewal.
Yeah, no, that's good. Good point. Richard has asked, do you think there'll be allowances for adaptations, i.e. a new bathroom with traditional bath may not be appropriate for all residents? Will provisions be made for that in terms of the specifications?
I would expect certainly in terms of modern facilities and the tie-in with the sort of Equality Act and Disability Act, etc., that there's going to have to be some recognition within the standard that those sorts of facilities are being sort of provided at the moment. It's very much it's a line in the business plan in terms of DDA type work and minor and major adaptations, etc. But it doesn't currently fall within the standard. So there seems to be suggestions there will be alignment with a lot of other legislation in terms of requirements, whether that's compliance or things like DDA or Equality Act, etc. So possibly wouldn't rule it out. And obviously we're trying to have a standard that meets the needs of all residents and not just sort of a certain proportion.
Okay, we've just got literally a couple of minutes left. So one other question was, do you think that there is a risk to push rents up to customers? Don't know whether you feel that's within scope of your expertise.
No, probably not. I mean, at the end of the day, that's sort of that third point really on the discussion points around the funding. Great, the standard needs updating, it needs a refresh, etc. But potentially with the criteria only requiring single elements to cause a failure, etc., and obviously the need to continue to maintain the home standard as a compliance requirement, that's got to be paid from somewhere. So if it's not from further sort of funding or what have you, then the only other route really is well, it has to come out of the income generated by rents. But obviously, with the certain restrictions around rents and increases, etc. Not my area of sort of expertise, but it's got to be paid for somehow. So it's got to come from one of sources, or something else is going to have to give, because there's only so much sort of resource that's available.
Yeah, no. I think that's probably all we've got time for. Apologies to anybody who posted a question that we haven't been able to respond to. We will, as I said at the start of the presentation, be able to respond to all of those via a sort of separate communication. So we look forward to adding those comments to the document which comes out to you as part of the recording. It's only really, I suppose, for me to say thank you very much to Mark for sharing his expertise and the expertise of Ridge and partners with us today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and thank you for everybody who attended. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time on another one of the PFH webinars.
Well, maybe we can do another one in March when we actually know the standard. Tell you actually what's happened rather than our best guess. So yeah, but no, thank you all very much for your time. Appreciate it, and hopefully you found that useful.
Yeah, thanks again, Mark. Thank you. Bye then.
All right, thank you.